Hi, I'm Matthew Clementi. I'm honored to be joined today by Marjolein Oele, who is joining me from Amsterdam on her sabbatical. She's a professor of philosophy at the University of San Francisco, who's trained as an MD in Amsterdam. And today, as part of the Hosting Earth series, we'll be speaking about her latest work on eco-affectivity and on the other themes and topics that align with this series. The Hosting Earth series is a one-day conference being held at Boston College in the spring of 2022, along with a series of lectures, talks, panels, symposia that are being organized over the course of this academic year by the Guestbook project. And I am hosting a series of dialogues in collaboration with the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series at the Lynch School at Boston College. What we'll be doing throughout this series is having conversations with thinkers who consider questions of how psychology, philosophy are impacted by the current eco-crisis and how these things affect not only us, but the world in which we live. So without much further ado, I'd like to get into the conversation and have a bit of time here for dialogue and discussion. Marjolein, the first thing I wanted to kind of use as an inroad to our conversation today is the topic, the theme of this conference, this series, Hosting Earth, of how we often, we are both hosts and guests of the earth, that we both live in the earth, but are welcome to live in the earth and can welcome the earth to ourselves. One of the topics that comes up in your recent book, Eco-Affectivity, which I've just read, and honestly, I would highly recommend it. It was excellent, excellent work, is this contrast that you draw between, early on, between soil and earth. And you start with this very moving image of burial, human burial in soil. You talk about the difference between soil, how it's always changing, and from one burial to the next, even if it's in the same cemetery, even if it's in the same season, the same day, the soil is never the same. But I was thinking about this in relation to our conversation today, how soil is something that both hosts us, we're welcomed into soil, and we take soil with us everywhere we go. We're obviously always eating food that comes from the soil, and we're kind of living in soil. So I kind of wanted to lead that in as an inroad and ask you for your thoughts on that reciprocity in relation to your work.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, for hosting me in this series and for engaging my work. And my book, Eco-Affectivity, is really trying to do something new insofar as it tries to address the eco, the milieu, the commonality, the co of our affectivity. And by affectivity, I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, as the Greeks have used it, and particularly Aristotle, suffering, undergoing, qualitative change, illness, and whatnot. My argument in the book is that we do well as humans, not just to focus on our own affects, on our own emotions, on our sense even of hosting or of being hosted, but to think beyond our own human abilities to be affected. And for that reason, I'm trying to dig into, for instance, the topic of soil, or into the topic of skin, or into the very materiality of the placenta, because I think that it is through understanding the biological tiered existence of our lives that we can get a better sense of where we are, our eco, and how we become to be who we are. And in that regard, this book is really about becoming, and it isn't an analysis of being. So that already indicates a radical departure from the more traditional accounts of looking at our location in terms of Earth. And there I'm thinking about the more messianic or provincial accounts, for instance, of Martin Heidegger when it comes to the notion of Earth. And I'm trying to contrast that with the messy material entanglements of something like soil. Now, soil, of course, functions for me as a figurative image insofar as soil for many of us is a place of consolation where we bury those who are close to us. But at the same time, it's also really the soil within which we build, from which we eat, from which we live, and of which we are part. So I'm trying to use both a material interface and the figure of soil to combat this notion of thinking who it is that hosts or is being hosted, but to really displace the human and to think, if you're really thinking seriously along the lines of soil, along its interfaces, along its pores, along its long-term endurance, what might then result from a future coming into being of a post-human? So in many ways, I am very receptive to the question that's being asked here today. At the same time, I also want to displace the question insofar as I want to step beyond the human as we know it. And I want to understand how it is that concrete beings are being produced every day ontogenetically from the earth, from this interface, and how, if you're following along this production of this interface, might we become changed to become new beings. That's my initial response here to your question.
So along those lines and following up on that, I mean, your final chapter is all about how this thinking in terms of soil gets us beyond the Anthropocene. I'm curious if you could unpack that a little bit and tell us what comes after or beyond the human when we begin to see the world in terms of soil or think this way.
Yeah, of course, it's a suggestive chapter, and that's not to bail myself out from answering that question, but it's also to refute easy answers to this question, precisely because I think we don't usually take the time to think beyond the human as we currently have it. Now, there's a few characteristics of soil that I think give us at least an indicator of what something like new beings could become. If we think about how soil and how long soil takes to really come to fruition, then this is an engagement of a project of the post-human that takes time. And also, this is a time where we ought to percolate rather than fix on short-term solution. So this image of percolation, of paying attention, of slowing down is crucial there. While at the same time, I also don't want to undermine the urgency of the very moment that we are living in. I use the example of how only now new generations of farmers can do no-tilling or employ more sustainable methods after the previous generation has passed away. In other words, our habitus, our way of being, of knowing and dealing with the soil sometimes really takes time to evolve, and oftentimes it takes a dying off of previous epistemic or familial knowledge to allow us to transition. And that means to say that I think that if we talk about a new human post the Anthropocene, then this has to be and becomes a human who's engaged in the long term, who engages with the messy here and now, who acknowledges the very fact of our temporary location as humans here on Earth, and at the same time is a being that is able to shake up the habitus, the long-term habits that we have acquired. That's all there. Plus, there is for me also a political note here that if we have to engage the Anthropocene, we also really have to combat the current economic and political regimes that are there. Because as we're thinking about how our habits have been shaped, then much of that is due to the economy. So I end in that note also with Bernard Stiegler asking us and provoking us to really think through resistance against the current political economic regimes.
Part of what I was thinking while reading your book and also listening to you is, you go back to Plato and to Aristotle at times. I was thinking of the first lines of the Phaedrus, where the very first lines where Socrates asks Phaedrus, where are you coming from and where are you going? And it's kind of that situatedness in the present that has to look back at where we come from and forward to where we're going, that you're kind of calling for with this notion of becoming. I wonder, as we think through the political crisis that you think also impacts and affects kind of where we're situated now, leaning forward toward the future, how does that open up toward new possibilities? So you talk about the dying away of old ideas, old systems, things that have obviously led to problematic situations. What opportunities are we opening towards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think with Michel Serres in his analysis of crisis, in his book that I like a lot, it's called Times of Crisis, What the Financial Crisis Revealed and How to Reinvent Our Lives in the Future. He analyzes crisis in multiple ways. One of them is through thinking through the crisis as the body faces it in a serious moment where either we can die or either the organism may reestablish itself in a different kind of way. Now that of course, that topic, as we're thinking of people in crisis mode in the ICUs due to COVID, comes to mind, but it also comes to mind as we think about the economic crisis and the enormous poverty in which many people now have fallen again due to the COVID crisis. There's something there in Michel Serres' ideas on crisis that ask us to allow access to the urgency of the question, and at the same time also think what might become out of this. And there is a hope that Serres utters for us to be reborn in a different kind of way. So crisis as a judgment, crisis as an opportunity, crisis as a way of being reborn is for Serres a motif as we think this topic. Now, as we think this topic of crisis, Serres is also allowing us to think through what got us into this crisis in the first place. Again, I am the historian here to also, with Serres, think through what have been the fault lines underneath these crises. And Serres, again, has been the prescient thinker in my mind to predict these pandemics, to predict in the 1990s the ecological crisis, and to predict the fact that humanity can make natural disasters much worse through the way that it deals with those disasters. So the task would be, in a mode of crisis, is to analyze what are the deeper tectonic shifts that have taken place, and at the same time to rethink a way forward. Now, I strongly believe with Serres that one of the ways forward is to do so in an interdisciplinary academic fashion. Everything stands and falls, in my mind, in philosophy, thinking through the ecological crisis by really trying to find a serious way for philosophers, in particular, since I am one, so I feel called to talk to the philosophers, to think through philosophy as an interdisciplinary affair so that we think along the lines of science of what's happening to our world. Now, I'm trying to do something like that in a modest way in my chapter on soil, for instance, trying to think what are the dynamics in soil, what happens in the pores of soil, what makes soil more fertile or less fertile. And I think it's really something to this degree of engaging with the scientific stuff of the world that we can allow science to speak a new language in community and in synthesis with the humanities, so that we find new words and a new discourse and thereby a new politics and ethics to become reborn. Now that's it's a prestigious, it's maybe an outrageous claim, but I also think that there is no other way out than to think through climate science, to think through our crises in an interdisciplinary way. And I think that we as philosophers stand there at a crossroads. I do think that there's much to be learned from a philosopher of science who's also a good phenomenologist such as Serres, to follow his lead and to think through new languages and thereby new discourses and new contracts for our new world.
Along these lines, one of the things I really admired about your book is I do think that in many ways it is it is embodying a type of philosophy that brings us down to the level of the mineral, let's say. So, philosophy is often thought of as God's eye view, taking a big look at the big picture and an overarching perspective on things. And yet, your book takes up and considers closely things like bird feathers, things like the placenta, as we've already talked about, but not only really bodily, physical, material aspects of the world, which, maybe an all too easy slight of philosophers is the attempt to idealize things and head off into the abstract, not only takes up the real phenomenological materiality of the world, but does so by really at times focusing in on the things that are often unnoticed. I mean, the idea of soil is a great example of something that's so essential to us, such a part of who we are, and yet that we don't even recognize as such, that our bodies are made from soil in many ways, that we're constantly living in and through soil. So I wonder if you think that this movement in philosophy that you're hoping to be a part of and hoping to kind of bring about is one that shifts the perspective from the macro to the micro, or if that's a fair characterization of what you're trying to do, or maybe you could just along those lines kind of expand on that.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Yeah, indeed, I'm trying to turn to the matter itself, and in that regard, I've always been an admirer of the anthropology, the philosophical anthropology of Helmut Plessner, for instance. There's also Nikolai Hartmann. Really, these attempts to think through the different tiers and complexities of matters without making that all part of one flat horizontal surface. So I really, in that regard, also admire the new materialists, but at the same time do want to combat this notion that everything thereby becomes to be on the same horizontal level and that everything becomes flattened out. I really want to think through the complexities of the different tiers, as I see it, of life and non-life. I do think I delve deeply into the specifics. An example of something that I was really excited about was my research into bird feathers and finding out how certain kind of traumas take up space in the bird feathers precisely through a lack of barbs or particular kinds of wires in the bird feather, so that the locations of trauma are sort of these vaulted spaces. But I also found out through bird research that an animal somehow can relocate the places of trauma to there where it is least harmful to its flight, for instance. Now, that's exactly where I think it's an example of a place where I think my research becomes at its strongest, namely delving into the very specifics of that fault bar, of what happens and how it's being relocated, while at the same time kind of looking at different kinds of birds and trying to also not generalize too easily, and at the same time draw conclusions or to draw philosophical implications from that. So again, from the micro back to the macro, if a philosopher is always to some degree always tied to the macro, then it is my idea that, for instance, through the fault bar, we can learn something about the biological reactivity or the affectivity of an animal. And there's beauty in the fact that a body can reallocate trauma and thereby, without thinking about it, still on another kind of level, is able to deal with its traumas. Now, trauma is always multiple. It can both be ameliorated, it can be worsened. So again, I'm not drawing broader conclusions there, but I'm showing ways in which life knows how to negotiate with its environment, with others around it, ways of being. And I think we as humans can learn from that. We can learn from that scientific research. And as philosophers, yeah, we can very carefully and without drawing big conclusions, we can learn from the materiality of our world. So the micro and the macro for me are connected. but we have to be very careful to too quickly slap on a macro idea on a micro topic. But I do think it is possible. Another example that I have been critiqued on is my analysis of the placenta, because I put so much analysis on the placenta that it seems as if the possible pregnant mother seems to be out of the question in this equation. And my task in that chapter is just to say, this is the biology of the process as it is oftentimes unfolding. We would do well to understand what it's like to be hosted, both as a possible future being coming into existence, as a possible future mother coming into existence. And I'm not thereby precluding particular ethical categories or ontological characters, but it is also to do justice to this very phenomenon of being hosted by an organ that has a truly magical, interesting material and directive powers called the placenta. So again, the micro is prominently there, and there are ideas associated with that, but one has to be super careful to rethink the implications there.
In relation to the topic of the placenta, one idea that you developed that I think is worth unpacking a little bit is the idea of the in-between. And in relation to plants, you talk about the middle voice. I mean, I don't want to do the work to unpack your ideas here, but I found both of these topics to be very interesting, and maybe you could talk a little more about each.
Yeah, for me, the interface, the in-between, where things emerge, that's what I find most interesting. For instance, in a chapter on skin, I'm trying to argue that we have become who we are in part due to this interesting emergence of this interface called the skin. And oftentimes as we think about humans, we think about sapiens, we think about our brain, but in many ways we have become who we are also through the sensitivity, through the softness, through the vulnerability of our skin. So the way our skin has evolved and lost hairs over evolutionary times, the way we've started to walk due to sort of seeking particular ways of accommodating our existence, this has allowed us in many ways to become the sapient sentient being that we are. So oftentimes it's in the interface between an organism as it is emerging and its environment and various factors. We could also talk about the microbiome and how it is in many ways determining who we are as human beings rather than just being defined as an individual. We, in this entanglement, we have become and are constantly still becoming. And I think it's a much more interesting place than to think from the center out towards the periphery, rather than to say it is through the surface that we find depth. It is through the interface that we can actually find the complexity of life. And what we find there is not individual beings, but always co-affected becomings. And that is also, I think, really helpful as a motto to make us both aware of our journey and of the possibilities of a future that is different and possibly only disastrous. Yeah.
So we are, I mean, being with this awareness of the in-between, always both in a state of becoming ourselves, being affected by that in which we live, we experience, we touch, we move, but also affecting everything around us. You know, everything is in this state of becoming for you, such that we're always affecting and being affected through the mediums in which we move.
That's right. And I think in that regard, my training as an MD has made it also very much aware to me, right, that from the inside out, from our bowels out to our skin, we're always constantly becoming. And also there we are in rented positions, as Sarah would have it, where we're always to some degree delivered over to this organism or to this being of which we are part. that is not to say, of course, that I don't want us to escape ethical responsibility, but the ethical responsibility, as I think we need to formulate it, isn't something that we as human beings need to form on our own terms, but again, through thinking through the interfaces of which we are part. So I've been asked this question too. Am I thinking of a Buddhist ethics? What kind of ethics am I thinking about? And I refuse these. I refuse this because I think it's still too much focused on the human of the now, and it's too much focused on the individual I. And it has to sort of really rethink, or we have to really rethink our co-entangled existence from a different place or milieu.
Marjolein, this has been absolutely a fabulous conversation. And thank you so much for being a part of the Psychologies of Earth series being co-hosted between the Guestbook Project and the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series at the Lynch School of Boston College. I hope we can continue this conversation further at another time, but thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Matthew, for this fascinating conversation and for hosting me here. Thank you.
Take care.